In previous lessons, I mentioned the fact that we're going to be talking about the problem of evil, and that's what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to unpack, essentially recapping what we've talked about with the problem of evil already, the ways in which the problem of evil presents a particularly unique challenge to Christian thinkers, and to any other thinker really, that and any other religion that has a belief in a God as some kind of omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. And we reference those two specific characteristics of God because we're talking about the idea of the inconsistent triad, which we're going to talk about in this lesson. And we'll talk about how Christians come about being able to explain away or being able to philosophize about the concept of the problem of evil and be able to justify the existence of both God and evil in the world. So we're going to be talking about the idea of the problem of evil and the ways essentially that we can respond to objections relating to the existence of God because of the existence of evil. This is one of the biggest, most colloquial challenges, at least, not necessarily among philosophers, but among the general populace. The idea that evil exists is straight away a critique of the existence of some kind of all-loving and all-powerful deity or entity. So we know from the last lessons that from a theological perspective, from a Christian doctrine perspective, the fall of Adam and Eve led to a world in which original sin exists. A original sin being the original sin that was committed by Adam and Eve by disobeying God, by eating from eating fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And according to the majority of Christians, as a result of Augustinian doctrine, early Christian doctrine, the suffering caused by death is actually a direct result of the existence of original sin. Original sin plays a very key role in the lives of every single individual ever since the original sin itself, ever since the fall of Adam and Eve. And while this is essentially one of the explanations or one of the justifications for the concept of evil, the idea that original sin as caused by Adam and Eve is what causes certain amounts of evil or certain amounts of problem within the world, the problem of evil itself is a much broader philosophical issue for Christians specifically, because we're talking about Christianity, because it seems to contradict with our basic understandings of the nature of God. This is the reference that I've made in the past to the idea of an inconsistent triad. So what the inconsistent triad tells us is that we can think about God, if we believe in the Christian doctrine, we can think about God as both all-powerful and all-loving, as both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. And it seems inconsistent, at least logically inconsistent, to have a world in which we have the existence of some kind of God that is all-powerful and all-loving, but that there also exists some evil in the world, or evil and suffering in the world. So if God was omnipotent, surely he'd have the power to eliminate all the evil in the world. So why does evil still exist if God can have the power to do it? Well, you might, if you just had those two aspects, if you just had omnipotence and evil, you might say, well, he's omnipotent, he can have the power to do it, but he's not omnibenevolent. He doesn't want to do it. He wants to allow people to suffer and have evil in the world. Well, that might be acceptable. You might be able to live consistently with that belief. You would have a belief in a God that wasn't particularly very loving, but you'd have a God that was all-powerful that just chose not to eliminate evil. Well, on the other hand, we could take out the omnipotent aspect. We could say, well, maybe we have a God that is omnibenevolent and he wants to get rid of the evil, but he can't. He doesn't have the power to. He's not omnipotent. So we have evil existing in the world, not because God wanted there to be evil in the world, but just because he has no power to get rid of it. Okay? Surely an omnibenevolent God would want to eliminate all evil in the world. That could be the alternative. And you can see here that we know obviously that evil and suffering exist in the world. For the most part, we can come to a philosophical conclusion on that particular basis. And so what we would be wrestling with is the idea of omnipotence and omnibenevolence. But while we can accept a world in which God can exist and evil can exist in the same place, if God is either omnipotent or omnibenevolent, We cannot accept a world in which evil exists and God exists, where God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Because if he was omnibenevolent and he did believe in loving everything, and it was all loving in general, okay, then you would have a world in which he would want to eliminate all evil in the world, and because if he was all omnipotent as well, he would have the power to do so. So this is why it's inconsistent. That's why it's inconceivable that we can have both of these characteristics of God, him being all powerful and all loving, and evil can still exist in the world. So this is essentially the problem of the inconsistent triad, and essentially the problem that philosophers have spent thousands of years trying to explain. So there are a number of different Christian responses to the problem of evil, of course, which is why I did say earlier on in this lesson that while this might be from a general public standpoint quite a good response or a good critique to Christian doctrine, for the most part when it comes to a philosopher's perspective, philosophers tend not to rely on the problem of evil as being particularly reliable, because Christians can explain the problem of evil away quite succinctly. So Christians over the years have come up with a great number of different responses to the problem of evil. There have been so many, and there has been such a detailed and academic area of thought that the idea itself has its own name. So it is called a theodicy. A theodicy is a philosophical argument that attempts to prove the existence of God in spite of the existence in evil in the world. So it is justifying the existence of God in a world where evil and suffering exist. This is known as a theodicy. And so, obviously, because it's got its own name, you can imagine that there's quite a lot of reading that you can do on the on theodicies. There have been many different theodicies in the long history of Christian thought. We will look at them in more detail when we come on to a separate topic, when we come on to the philosophy of religion topic. But we will just touch on them very, very briefly in this lesson. So it should be noted that many people would often make a distinction between different kinds of evil. I think it makes sense that when we're talking about deconstructing the inconsistent triad, we can spend a lot of time deconstructing the characteristics of God, the idea of him being omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but we don't often spend that much time deconstructing the third of those, which is the idea that evil and suffering exists in the world. Well, how can we come to some kind of distinction between that? Well, many philosophers would come to the conclusion that there can exist different kinds of evil. So, for example, we could talk about natural evils versus moral evils. So what does this mean? What's moral versus natural evil? Well, a natural evil is a kind of evil, a kind of horrible thing, essentially, that is caused by completely natural circumstances, has completely natural causes. So, for example, an earthquake that kills thousands of people, that is an evil in the sense that there's a lot of death and a lot of suffering and a lot of pain that is involved in this particular process. But nobody would place any kind of moral weight on the earthquake. The earthquake isn't immoral for existing. It is just a natural thing that is caused as a result of us living on a planet with tectonic plates. One could make the claim that it was evil, but it was natural. So you can sort of suggest that it is a kind of evil, but not a kind of evil that is necessarily linked to the kind of visceral responses that people have, the real emotional responses people have when it comes to the existence of moral evils. These are the evils that take place as the result of the moral actions of individuals. So a child murderer, or an actual murderer, anybody like that, or a serial killer, or something like that, or the Nazi party. All of these are moral evils. Some Christians believe that the original sin that is caused by the fall of Adam and Eve is responsible for the existence of moral evils, but it doesn't explain in that regard why natural evils exist. Now, you could get into the weeds in this kind of debate very, very, very quickly, because some people might argue on the basis of what we know today in today's society about the concepts of psychology and sociology, to what extent is a serial killer not influenced by the environment in which that individual has existed. A lot of serial killers are subject to abuse as children and all these kind of different things. And to what extent do people have the free will to make these decisions? As you can see, me just saying those 3 or 4 sentences can give you an idea, an indication of just how deep into the weeds you can get on these kind of philosophical debates. But this isn't undergraduate, this isn't A-level, this is GCSE, so we'll forget about that for the time being. Like I said, we do not explain natural evils using this original sin perspective. Other Christians may take the view that the world is a test, either a test of morality or maybe even a test of faith. If there were some evil that takes place, one might feel that they want to abandon their faith in God. So it doesn't matter what kind of evil, moral or natural. If you are subject and a victim of some kind of evil, maybe an earthquake, a volcano, or a murder victim, or maybe someone who you're very close to has been a victim of some kind of horrendous crime, you might think that that kind of suffering might want somebody to stray away from their faith in God and abandon their faith. So for that reason, you might say that God exists and is omnibenevolent and is omnipotent, but he allows evil to take place because he wants to test the faith of Christians around the world. He wants to test the faith. And if you're an individual who, when confronted with some kind of evil and some kind of suffering, sort of buys in further to the faith in Christianity, faith in God and belief in God, then you might say, well, then you have passed that test. This idea could explain the existence of both natural evils and moral evils. It doesn't require there to be any kind of delineation. Another view is that God loves and is all-powerful and evil exists in the world, but God gives us free will. So it is not up to God to intervene in problems within humanity to stop evil from taking place. With us all having free will, God allows us to make our own choices and decisions. And if we decide to do evil things, that is our choice, and the consequences of that will be dealt with by other human beings. Again, this can explain the existence of moral evils, but it does not explain the existence of natural evils. It also means that we have problems if we talk about the free will argument, if we tie in another characteristic of God, the idea that God is omniscient, is all-knowing. If God knows every single thing that is going to happen or could possibly ever happen, then how can we have free will if God has already essentially understands exactly what is going to happen and what human beings are going to do? Again, another philosophical debate that would really get into the weeds, and you can fall into a rabbit hole very, very quickly. But as you can see, we have the existence of evil in the world, we have the problem of evil that we have to deal with, but there are different Christian responses to them. We will talk about specific theodicies in a future lesson when we do look at the philosophy of religion topic for GCSE Religious Studies, when we talk about people like Irenaeus and St. Augustine, who came up with their own different theories of why evil exists in the world, and then we'll look at some modern theodicies as well.